Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk today about the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, the most ambitious peace conference that had ever been to date, although it's been eclipsed throughout as followed in later days. It was a conference not only to settle one peace, the peace with Germany, but to make peace with all the combatant powers and to deal with a lot of things that were never involved in the war at all. People often refer to the peace settlement as the settlement of Versailles. That really is technically wrong. I just explain that point. The peace conference met in Paris. It met all over the place, wherever they could get people into committee rooms. But when they were actually having the signature of a peace treaty, they needed some bigger assembly hall, somewhere that Paris couldn't provide. And therefore what they did, the French fortunately had a number of palaces scattered round Paris, and they took over one of these for the day. The most important was, of course, the peace treaty with Germany, which was signed at Versailles. So you're entitled to refer to the Treaty of Versailles, but you're not entitled to refer to the Congress or Conference of Versailles. There were plenty of other moves out to palaces. When they signed the peace treaty with Little Austria, that was done at Saint-Germain. The peace treaty with a very much curtailed Hungary was signed at Trianon. And if I get it right, later on, the peace treaty with Bulgaria was signed at Neuilly, and the peace treaty with Turkey would have been signed at Sèvres, but they never got it off the ground as a peace treaty because the Turks turned against it. Another interesting point. The Peace Conference of 1919 was not a Congress, even though it was far more people attended it than attended the earlier Congresses. The difference is this: the Peace Conference of Paris drew up the peace treaties with the enemies. Then when late enemies, such as Germany or Austria or Hungary, when the peace treaty was ready, the defeated foe sent delegates which turned up at a meeting not to argue, but solely to sign the peace treaty. In other words, what met at Paris was a conference, and because the enemy was never represented in this conference, it never became a Congress. In 1878, for instance, the Turks, who'd been defeated in the recent war, turned up for the Congress just as much as the Russians turned up. But no Congress, and in fact no Congress I think has ever been held since, because again in 1945 the Germans didn't get much a look in to say what they had to say. So what we have is an enormous gathering of diplomats, committees of all kinds, committees dealing with this point, committees dealing with that point, and a directing body which started with about 12 foreign secretaries from main countries and swelled up sometimes to 20 or so. But after the conference, which met originally in January, had been meeting for a little while, quite without authority from anyone except themselves, the really great men took it over and became the directing bodies. The great men were originally the big three. President Wilson, the most important because he was a sovereign in himself. He was a directing power. Lloyd George, who was a prime minister at any rate, and Clemenceau from France. After about a month or so, Orlando, who really hadn't had much to do with the war except in Italy, but he'd never been involved in the French war, Orlando came from Italy and became one of the big four, though his standing was nothing like as great as theirs. And after that again, there came a representative from Japan. This was awkward. It made the numbers up to 5. And they raised the question with the Japanese, what will happen if the European delegates vote 2 each? To which the Japanese delegate replied very ingeniously, Japan always goes with the majority. How you get a majority when it's 2-all is difficult to say, but that is a course that Japan followed from thereafter. The Supreme Council, it was called, was more than merely a negotiating body. It took over the Supreme War Council, which had run the war in its latter stages, so that it was both an executive body deciding where armies should go to, what steps should be taken of a purely practical kind, as well as a negotiating body. The big three, or big four, were not very well instructed, say, in the techniques of European geography. Harold Dickinson describes going to a meeting of the big four in President Wilson's private flat. Well, that's another thing about the Supreme Council. It didn't have an official meeting place. It just met in Wilson's flat. And Dickinson describes going in to give some advice to the big four and finding these great men, all men, I suppose, in their 50s or 60s, crawling about over the floor, studying maps and discovering places they'd never heard of before, of which they were going to decide the fate, to move the frontiers and do things of this kind. Their predominant question, it's true, their predominant problem was peace with Germany, the only great power among the enemy powers. Austria-Hungary had been a great power, but it had dissolved into pieces. It had become Austria, a republic, Hungary, another republic, and at that moment a left-wing republic at that, and then new states which had been carved out of the old Austrian Empire, particularly Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, which was a transformation of the Kingdom of Serbia into an enlarged Slav state, much of which had been Austrian. Hungary, I don't say it had ranked as a great power, but it had been a significant power. It had lost far more territory than it should have lost, because whenever one of the succession states, as it was called, claimed Hungarian territory, they got it, even though it was inhabited by Czechs or Romanians. When the Hungarians tried to put up the same case, they were pushed aside as former enemies. But the basic question was to make a peace treaty with Germany. There were many, the determining factor behind them all was a system, a series of principles which Wilson had laid down just before America entered the war, the 14 points. These were to lay down a pattern, not only for the world, for the League of Nations and so on, but particularly dealings with Germany. The Germans, in September 1918, had accepted the 14 points. It's fair to say that the Allies had not. They were not told them at all until about a fortnight before the war ended, and both England and France made some, though not very important, reservations about them. When they got to the peace conference, they just tried to avoid them altogether, and when President Wilson kept referring to the peace conference, they pushed it aside, and that's not practical affairs. The first thing they had to deal with in Germany was to determine the new frontiers. Quite easy for France to recover Alsace and Lorraine, which indeed the French did, I think, without ever making a peace treaty. They said it's always been ours and we just move into it. The problem of German frontiers lay on the eastern side. Here is one of the, I won't say the biggest problem of the peace conference, but a considerable one, and that takes us straight back to the Peace Congress of 1814. What was the main problem of 1814? It was whether Poland should be resurrected. What was the predominant, or a predominant problem of the Peace Conference of 1919 and 1920? It was not so much whether Poland should be resurrected. The Allies had agreed that that was to happen, but what territories should Poland have? Should it have solely territory inhabited by Poles, or was it entitled to go back to the earlier, say, 17th century and claim vast territories which Poland had occupied, consisted of, long before Poland itself dissolved? At any rate, the Polish question was to give, before the conference ended, the most acute problems and bring the Allies nearest back to war. I'll mention that again later. There were other territories which were lost to Germany, bit of territory to Belgium, bit of territory to Denmark. But the main consideration was twofold, perhaps more than that. One, the Allies, the British and the French, had ended the war with a promise that Germany should be made to pay. Pay what? Pay strict damages, which the Germans had called, pay on a high grade of penalties, or simply pay all the costs of the war, including what it had cost to England, France, America, and anybody else. Actually, the Americans didn't ask for the costs of war, but the British did, and the French still more. And the Belgians took the view that they had been particularly badly treated because Germany invaded them without any excuse whatsoever, and that they ought to be compensated down to the last franc. Then, a topic which took up a lot of trouble and negotiation, war criminals should be punished. But what are war criminals? War criminals are leaders on the other side who not so much have caused the war, but have lost it. That's why war criminals get punished. They don't get punished because they started the war. They get punished because they were fools enough to lose it. And then in 1919, the Allies had only one chief criminal. That was the ex-Kaiser who'd taken refuge in Holland. The Dutch refused to release him. The Allies talk of occupying Holland, of banning Holland, of blockading Holland. The Dutch just said, we do not surrender the Kaiser. And after 2 or 3 years of argument, they didn't surrender him. But they'd put in the treaty that he was the supreme war criminal. There were trials in Germany of a few war criminals amounting to nothing. Indemnities took up a lot of discussion. And then there was a discussion whether the Allies should dictate a new form of government. Fortunately, the Germans themselves had had a revolution and had established a parliamentary republic, so the actual dictation of a form of government didn't arise. But these were, remember again, that the distribution of territory was not only depriving Germany of territory, but what should happen to the German colonies. The British in particular held the view that they should get the German colonies on a very simple principle. When Great Britain goes to war, she always gets some colonies. The British therefore invented the idea that the Germans were worse at ruling colonies than they were, and that they, or the dominions as they were, should get some of the German colonies. Most important of all were the precautions which should be taken so that Germany couldn't renew the war or have a Second World War. And the precautions were of two kinds. One, the actual size of the German army was restricted. I think altogether 100,000 men. And the armaments were restricted, no tanks, no aircraft, and so on. The other precaution that was taken was that the whole of West Germany, that is to say Germany up to the Rhine and in certain cases beyond, the whole of West Germany was put under Allied occupation. The Treaty of Versailles didn't speculate how long, though it did suggest it would be for 15 or 25 years. In any case, then there was something else very important from the British point of view. Not only was the German Navy to be surrendered, and it was surrendered so wholeheartedly that the Germans then sank it just at the time when the peace treaty was being signed, but they were to have no more navy, at any rate until the peace treaty could be revised in 10 or 20 years. But these were some of the things which were discussed by the Supreme Council, and in time they got a peace treaty ready. And finally, they had this elaborate ceremonial at the Palace of Versailles when the German delegates came in. They were told that they couldn't make any reply, though in fact one of them made a short speech just saying, more or less, that the loser has to have a peace treaty imposed on him, and that the Germans signed purely after protest. But it was the most symbolic act at the peace conference was the signing of this extraordinary, you can't call it a peace treaty, it was a treaty calculated to provoke the Germans and lead them to work for a wholesale revision of the treaty and a restoration of Germany back into the ranks of civilized nations. President Wilson was very anxious indeed to get the League of Nations going. Indeed, he made it a condition with his allies that they should draw up a charter, a draft of the League of Nations before they did anything else, and that it should be the first clause in the German peace treaty, because the German peace treaty will be the first to be signed, therefore you get the League of Nations in first. The curious situation is that although Wilson always talked high about the peace treaty, he hadn't thought about it in practical terms, and he'd no draft of how it should be constituted, no constitution, no rules, no charter altogether of the League of Nations. And Wilson was just hopeless about this and saying, well, when can we do this? When the British Foreign Secretary said, oh, we went into this at the beginning of the war, we drew up a charter of the League of Nations, and here it is. So what in fact Wilson imposed on the world was a draft League of Nations which had been prepared by the British really under quite different circumstances. It was regarded by Wilson and by many people at the time as the greatest step forward. This was the principle at the League of Nations, which was to bring all the powers together and to lead to international affairs being carried out not only by negotiation but through the instrumentality of the League of Nations, which would gradually make rivalry, hostility between the independent states unnecessary and unlikely. At any rate, if one was to say what people thought at the time was the really sensational thing about the Peace Conference of Paris, they would not have said, I think, the Treaty of Versailles, that was something that was bound to happen, that you take it out of the Germans. But the League of Nations was to bring something quite new and quite special. The great powers who directed the League of Nations, because you had a League of Nations Council composed of the greater powers and then an assembly with all the lesser ones, the greater powers were, it was supposed, committed to support the League of Nations and somehow to solve the problem of enforcing the declarations of the League of Nations without armed force. Though what you do when one of the members of the League of Nations break away was not clear at the time. The League of Nations was a promise for the future. It wasn't dealt with at Paris at all. The Peace Conference at Paris spent, I think, more times drawing up frontiers in Central and Eastern Europe than in dealing, say, the German frontiers were done in a couple of days. But the whole of East Europe was in a turmoil. The older states, particularly Austria-Hungary, had collapsed, and great stretches of territory were disputed. Broadly speaking, and I think it's the gravest reproach against the Peace Conference of 1919, the various committees drawn up tended, when they were faced with a decision to make between two powers, always to support the Allied power, or one which had claimed to be the Allied power. There's a great deal more that I could tell you about the Peace Conference, but the two most important things in settling the pattern of Europe were the various indemnities. Poor little Austria, which was bankrupt, had to pay an indemnity. Hungary had to pay an indemnity, though the only way in which they could do it was to borrow money either from American banks or British banks. So in the end, it was the British banks who paid the indemnity to the Allies. Don't try and work out how that happened, too complicated. There's plenty that was left over, which was to raise problems in the future. Turkey broke away from the system because the Sultan was overthrown, though the Allies continued to recognize him, and a new Turkey started in Turkey, Asia Minor, led by Kemal Atatürk. This was to nearly cause war in 1922. And Turkey came out much better than anyone else because by having broken with the Sultan and turned into a revolutionary state, had been able to assert herself as a great power or something like it. At any rate, the Turks did not pay any indemnity, and they did not lose any territory, rather the reverse. The gravest problem at the peace conference, which they were never able to solve, was what to do with Soviet Russia. Soviet Russia had made peace with Germany. The moment that the Germans gave in, the Bolshevik government simply repudiated the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and therewith did not pay any more indemnities to the Germans or indeed to anyone else. They simply declared their independence. The Allies counted for much against the Bolsheviks. Firstly, they had made peace. For this, they ought to be punished. Secondly, when they repudiated the treaty with Germany, they were no longer paying indemnities to anyone, but were trying to build up their own state. Thirdly, of course, they were Bolshevik, which was very undesirable in 1919. And one of the minor activities of the Supreme Council was to conduct a very ineffective war of intervention, which the French and the British, and to a lesser extent the Americans, conducted against Bolshevik Russia. By 1920, the problem had become acute, not in terms of either direct intervention in European Russia or Asiatic Russia, but the fact that Poland, quite without any justification, had decided to reclaim all the territory which she possessed in the 17th century. And Pilsudski led an army as far as Kiev, which is far down in southern Russia, not a single Pole inhabiting it. Much to the dismay of anybody, the Bolsheviks hit back. The Red Army, directed by Trotsky, defeated the Poles and drove them right out of Russia and advanced on Warsaw. They were within sight of Warsaw, and if they'd got to Warsaw, they'd have proclaimed a Bolshevik Poland and then marched on into Germany. Fortunately for the Poles, the Russian advance was stopped, and they were able to advance back in their turn and to acquire not only the territory which they'd been rectified by the Allies, but some which they claimed themselves. But Poland was still in danger in August 1920. The French said they must intervene on the Polish side. Lloyd George talked about this, was threatened with a general strike by the TUC, and fortunately, before he had to make up a decision, it's quite clear he never intended to support the Poles. He took a very poor view of them, was much more in favor of the Bolsheviks. But what it all happened with is that there was no armed assistance from the Allies, and that they regarded Poland with great irritation from having caused this crisis. But the Polish crisis of 1920 was only one of many crises which were to originate from the logical consequences of the Peace Treaty of 1919. And in the end, it was Poland, which had nearly caused a war in 1920, which caused a war in 1939.